you have a very different and I think very interesting perspective, both as a relatively small, dynamic emerging economy who can't dictate what's going on in the world, and with a very turbulent environment, as we've discussed. Here we have the dominant superpower, one of the two dominant superpowers, which is apparently completely in the process of changing its industrial policies overnight. So how do you see this from your context in ASEAN, in Asia, between the US and China, Europe? How do you navigate this?
Thank you. Well, Martin, it's not easy to navigate this. For Malaysia, of course, as you mentioned, we're a small economy, a mid-sized economy, number 33, 34 largest economy in the world. But we are very much an open economy. If you look at Malaysia, our trade to GDP is about 180%. And when you talk about industrial policy, as a policymaker, when we do policies, including industrial policy, it just so happened that we just had a new industrial master plan launched last year, is to see how a policy such as industrial policy has the right spillover to the economy. We want to see the economy grow. We want to see it grow sustainably, inclusive growth as well, because that's always the problem, right? When you talk about growth, whether it's inclusive and sustainable. So back to trade and back to industry. For Malaysia, the industry policy has really helped the country grow. If you look at us, for example, for Malaysia, 80% of export is manufacturing, only 20% agriculture. And the manufacturing sector contributes a quarter or 25% of our GDP. Similarly for ASEAN, right? As you look at ASEAN, it is a relatively big economy as a bloc. It's the fifth largest economic bloc, population 680 million, GDP 3.8 trillion US dollars, growing at 4 to 5%. With that trajectory, we should be the fourth largest economic bloc. But why are we successful? Of course, peace and prosperity helps, but also because of the openness of the economies within ASEAN. So we are very much pro-multilateral-based organizations. Even Malaysia itself, we just came back from another FTA that we signed with UAE, that was FTA number 17. We're part of many bilateral and multilateral FTA. 2 days ago, we just came back from Brussels to reopen, to rediscuss our Malaysia-EU FTA. And it goes back to why? Why? Because industries sees the push from industries, of course, but the spillover to the economy. So navigating US-China is going to be important for Malaysia and ASEAN, simply because of the supply chain that is so critical to the region. You mentioned about realigning of supply chain. Companies are talking to us, they are redesigning it based on resiliency, based on security, but also based on commercial reasons. So this is where, as a policymaker, when we talk to our neighbors, when we talk to our friends, we need to diversify and mitigate. There's no way we can eliminate that risk, and we've seen, as you mentioned, some of the announcements that were made yesterday. Is there more to come? We don't know. There's nothing on tariff yet, but it is probably inevitable. So we need to ensure that we mitigate this by mentioning about green transition. We have launched our national energy transition roadmap. We talk to our neighbors about ASEAN Grid. We talk about how important it is about making sure renewable energy is accessible not to just one country but the rest, and how investments related to that and can support the industry, because industries also are expected to embrace this circular economy. So similarly for digital, we talk about AI, but then there's also concern about chips, export restriction on chips, etc. This will all have an impact to the countries, because back to the industrial policy, there's always fiscal support as well, supporting those industrial policy. There's monetary policy to some extent, but fiscal support is very hard to have a level playing field when small countries, mid-sized countries, do not have that fiscal space to support their industrial policies relative to the larger countries like US, China, etc. Thank you.
So, Minister, how do you feel even a few months ago, we were still talking about the possibility for various countries of becoming China plus one, moving stuff out of China into your country. And this has been a big part of the debate in India, which I know relatively well. But that's also true for other countries in ASEAN. Those opportunities look a bit riskier now. This sort of gets to a really key question. What we're seeing, one of the really big things that was attempted in the international trading system, you referred to it, multilateralism, was to make trade policy relatively predictable, which is very important for business everywhere. And that's becoming impossible, isn't it? How do you manage that?
First of all, I think we must recognize that what's happening between US and China is not new. There's Trump 1.0, and then Biden continued, and then now we're seeing this maybe brought to a greater degree of tension. But for us in Malaysia, and also for ASEAN, we have no choice but to navigate this. Who's our largest trading partner for ASEAN and for Malaysia is China. Who's number two is the US. Who's the largest investor in the ASEAN region is US. Who's the second largest? It's China. The top two economies in the world, you add them together, it's close to 50% of the GDP. So we have to play this carefully because, as you know, we've seen this played out and we've seen how companies react, how governments as well react. In fact, the supply chain realignment, redesigning of supply chain was also accelerated by COVID as companies really looking at the security of that supply chain. And for Malaysia and for ASEAN as well, we have actually been a net beneficiary. And if you look at global FDI, it's negative, but global FDI to ASEAN, it's positive. Is this sustainable? It all depends on the growth of the global economy. Because at the end of the day, there's a demand side, there's a supply side. So for Malaysia, you mentioned semiconductor, we are fortunate because for semiconductor is an industry that we built over the last 5 decades. We are 6th largest supplier of semiconductor, and therefore we are in a sweet spot where the ecosystem is already there. Incentives help, but the fact that you have the ecosystem there will definitely have ecosystem, not just meaning the logistics, but also the infrastructure of the semiconductor industry is already in place, talent, etc. So for us to navigate this, like you said, when we talk to the companies in the region, many are actually producing intermediate goods for both US and China. In fact, some are exporting to China, but how strategic that intermediate good is when it's exported to become a finished good, that's debatable. So the concern will be two. Number one is whether that China plus one or Europe plus one or Taiwan plus one is a way to circumvent the potential restriction both in tariff or export. And the second one is actually on to us is the growth of the economy, the trade numbers. Because if trade goes down, investors, companies will put on hold their decision. And this will slow down a vicious cycle, right? So that's something that we need to navigate.